I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today we're taking a tour of every painting by a woman at London's National Gallery. Today we are exploring the National Gallery in London once again. This is my fourth video here in this museum, and in my opinion, it's the single best art collection in the world. My Patreon video this October will be on the spookiest paintings here, but today I want to focus on the most unusual paintings here because they are by women. On our tour today, we're going to see historic works by 9 different female artists, as well as 2 more contemporary works. In some ways, I hate to separate these formidable artists out as female painters. I mean, that already others them, as if to say in a historical context that a painter, full stop, is a man, and a female painter needs a special adjective. But it would be disingenuous to pretend that there isn't a special designation needed for the only 9 female painters whose canvases are on display currently at the National Gallery. We must give them special attention, otherwise the imbalance goes unchallenged. As the Guerrilla Girls said, do women have to be naked to get into the Met? I mean, the same can be said for the National Gallery. There's countless naked female bodies on the wall, but very few women behind the easel. To prepare for this video, I reread the seminal article, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?, written 50 years ago by feminist art historian Linda Nochlin. She makes the argument that it was the oppressive institutions and systems of power that prevented women artists from achieving the same level of recognition of their male counterparts, not their lack of talent or drive. Now, today in 2025, we pretty much accept this as common sense, but in the mid-1970s, this was groundbreaking. I mean, as we see again and again, women in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries didn't have access to formal arts education. They didn't have access to the life drawing classes, anatomy lessons, and apprenticeships that their male counterparts did. That said, the women on our tour today did claw their way to success, but usually, not always, but usually because either their husbands, fathers, or both were successful painters in their own right. They were usually confined to painting portraits and domestic scenes, but some, like Artemesia Gentileschi and Rosa Bonheur, bucked this tradition, as we'll see. There are quite a few groundbreaking women artists throughout Europe between the 16th and 19th centuries who aren't represented here at the National Gallery. They are trying to increase their diversity here, so hopefully we will soon acquire pieces by Michelina Wautier, Sofonisba Anguissola, Plotilla Nelli, Lavinia Fontana, Louise Mouillon, Mary Beale, Elisabetta Siranu, Esther Inglis, Fide Galizia, Elizabeth Sophie Chéron, Marie Gabrielle Capet, Adelaide Labie Gardier, and of course Mary Cassatt, and the many others who paved the way for women artists today. If this is your first time to my channel, welcome. I'm delighted to have you here, and I hope that you choose to hit subscribe. However, if you're a regular viewer and you'd like even more content, click the link below for my Patreon channel. I release an extra video tour every single month. Let's start now in chronological order with Catharina van Hemmesen and the oldest painting by a woman in the National Gallery. This little painting was only recently put on display. As some of you may know, part of the National Gallery was closed for nearly 5 years for renovation, and it reopened on May 10th. Now they really have the space and capacity to show off the breadth of the collection, including this wee piece by Catharina van Hemmesen called Portrait of a Woman. Now, if her name doesn't ring a bell, you're not alone. I didn't even know this was in the collection until recently, but she really was very remarkable. Van Hemmesen is the earliest female Flemish artist whose work survives, and at that, only about a dozen pieces survive. Like so many of our other painters today, she was trained in the workshop of her father. He was the prolific Antwerp painter Jan Sanders van Hemmesen. Now this portrait says Catharina van Hemmesen painted this 1551. Remarkably, she was only 23 years old. Let's look now at one of her self-portraits, not here at the National Gallery, but we have the first instance on our tour of a woman painting herself at an easel holding a palette. Now, this may seem rather normal. After all, it's a self-portrait of an artist. Why wouldn't they be painting? But with female artists in history, we see this far more often than with their male counterparts. They actually need to tell us, hey, this isn't a typical portrait by a man. I painted this. I'm not just the model. As for the sitter in this painting, her identity is lost to the ages, but we know she was wealthy. She's wearing a fine shirt ornamented with black embroidery, and her dress's bodice is made from silk, with sleeves of red velvet and a black damask skirt. I love that she has a little lapdog tucked under his arm, and he has little bells on his collar. Van Hemmesen has conformed to the style popular at the Habsburg court in the 1550s, but ironically, her identity as a female painter made her work quite desirable, almost as a talking point for the buyer. Sadly, not a lot of scholarly work has been published about Catharina van Hemmesen. Of the women on our tour today, she is the least well known. But now, let's head to arguably the best known on our tour. Artemesia Gentileschi is the most famous female painter of the 17th century and one of the most celebrated artists, full stop, in art history, in particular the Baroque period. She was bold and brash and unafraid to take on the big biblical and historic subjects that we see our other female painters avoiding for a variety of reasons. Now, every other painter in the 17th century was also painting these same topics, but Gentileschi brings something unique into the mix. Here at the National Gallery, we have her self-portrait as Catherine of Alexandria, and it's a very different self-portrait to the others on our tour. Born in 1593, her father was Baroque painter Orazio Gentileschi, and she began painting professionally when she was just 15, initially in the then popular style of Caravaggio. He's in my first National Gallery video. This piece by her father, Orazio Gentileschi, is just across the room from Artemesia. Gentileschi was the first woman to become a member of the Accademia di Arte in Florence, and she attracted clients from around Europe. Sadly, in some ways, though, her life story has overshadowed her art, and it's infuriating but not surprising that we have to address sexual assault when speaking about Artemesia's works. She was raped by an acquaintance of her father, artist Agostino Tassi, when she was just 17. The story is quite involved, and I will leave the circumstances around the sexual assault there, but you can investigate further. Her father was immediately concerned for his daughter's reputation and arranged for Tassi and Artemesia to be engaged. But after 9 months, it became clear Tassi was not going to follow through on the marriage. Orazio then took him to court, not for the rape, mind you, but for the breach in contract. During the sensational trial, Artemesia was subjected to torture with a sibyl. Those are cords wrapped around the fingers and pulled tight, and this was done to, quote, verify her testimony. As the pain became unbearable, she is recorded as turning to Tassi and saying, "This is the ring that you give me, and these are your promises." Tassi was found guilty and exiled from the art world. Orazio then arranged for Artemesia to marry Pier Antonio Stiatesi, with whom she had 5 children. Only one, her daughter Prudentia, also known as Palmyra, lived until adulthood. In 2011, Francesco Salinas discovered a collection of 36 letters dating from about 1616 to 1620 between Artemesia and Florentine nobleman Francesco Maria Maringhi. They had a passionate love affair with the full permission of her husband. Spicy. After the affair, she lived in a number of Italian cities, including Florence, where she became a household name and had a booming business. Here are some of her accounting papers. This is the period when our painting here dates to. Later, in the 1630s, she spent time here in England painting for Charles I. He was a lavish art collector. I'll talk about him more in my next National Gallery video, not the spooky one after that. This recently discovered Susanna and the Elders was painted during this time in the late 1630s, and it's on temporary display at Holyrood in Edinburgh. Here in England, she had a passionate love affair with Charles's music teacher, Nicholas Lanier. Do it, lady. It was traditionally believed that Gentileschi died in 1652 or 1653, but today we have found evidence that she was still painting in 1654, albeit with a lot of help from her assistant, Onofrio Palumbo, and she actually died of plague in 1656. She was buried at the San Giovanni Battista di Fiorentini in Naples. Tragically, her tomb was destroyed when the church was demolished in the 1950s. Phew! That was a lot of biography, but Gentileschi is a really fascinating person. Let's now come back to our stunning painting here at the National Gallery. As I mentioned, this is Self-Portrait as St. Catherine of Alexandria, and it's just so poignant once you know her life story. It was painted just 5 years or so after the torture during her rape trial. Current research suggests that this may have been started as a self-portrait and was later modified to represent the saint as well. Here we see her as the Christian saint who died for her faith in Egypt in the early 4th century. Catherine of Alexandria was tortured on a breaking wheel, that is, a spiked wooden wheel on which a person would be affixed. Then their bones would be broken with a cudgel so that their body could be laced through the spokes. They would be hung up in public view for days until they died. Some people are recorded as staying alive for weeks afterward. According to her medieval hagiography, and that means a saint's biography, the real St. Catherine is said to have broken the wheel with just her touch, and so Emperor Maxentius then sentenced her to a beheading. Artemesia as St. Catherine shows us a martyr's palm held between her thumb and forefinger. And she's shown with her Catherine wheel. We can see this in classic three-quarter pose, common in her self-portraits. The shape of her royal crown is visible through her headscarf, and a faint halo is just visible, though some art historians believe that could have been added in later centuries. When the National Gallery purchased it in 2018 for £3.6 million, it was the first painting by a woman acquired since the Institute purchased 5 works by then artist-in-residence Paula Rego in 1991. That piece, Crivelli's Garden, is coming up later, and it's one of my favorites. Now, there has been a renewed interest in Gentileschi since Naucklin's 1971 essay, and she is now often heralded as one of the great painters of the 17th century. But not everyone's such an adoring fan. American professor Camille Paglia argues instead that Artemesia Gentileschi was simply a polished, competent painter in the Baroque style created by men. I mean, Camille, she didn't really have much choice in the 1600s. Let's now have a look here at one of my favorite painters of the Dutch Golden Age, Judith Leyster. She's now a celebrated artist, beloved as one of the Haarlem painters of the 17th century. However, for over 250 years, Leyster's works were falsely attributed to men. See, although she was well known and well regarded in her lifetime, she was almost completely forgotten after her death and often intentionally written out of the art history books. Thankfully, she was rediscovered in 1893 during a lawsuit between an art dealer and his vendor. They revealed that tons of her work had been attributed to Frans Hals. The Louvre got involved and found Leyster's interlocking JJ monogram under the fabricated signature of Hals. Critic Cornelius Hofstede de Groot then wrote the first article about Leyster, correctly attributing 7 of her paintings that had previously sold as Hals works. You can see that their styles are indeed similar. Leyster was one of Hals' peers and is sometimes cited as one of his students, although there's no evidence for this. That said, we know she indeed had students of her own, which was rare for a woman artist. Leyster also bucked the trend in another way. She wasn't the daughter of an artist. She was born into a family of weavers as the 8th of 9 children, but her family supported her to study painting between the ages of 11 and 16, at which time she began to apprentice under painter Franz Peters de Greber and became the first woman to join the Haarlem Guild. She married fellow painter Jan Miens Molnar. Here's one of his paintings hanging in the same room as this Leyster painting. This one is one of my very favorites in the Dutch Golden Age galleries. I think that these children look so much more realistic and imbued with life than her husband's iteration. Female painters would have historically spent a lot more time with children, and so it just makes sense to me she could capture them with more realism. Well, the painting, by the way, is called A Boy and a Girl with a Cat and an Eel. I just love their clothing. It was a custom in Holland at the time to dress kids like mini adults. I always joke that no one looks older than a little girl in a Dutch Golden Age painting. Leyster is probably intending her painting as an allegory to draw attention to bad behavior in adults. This was common at the time. The scene illustrates the old Dutch expression, he who plays with cats gets scratched. Or in other words, don't go looking for trouble. Little girls were supposed to set good examples for their brother, even if they were younger, and while this little girl is admonishing us with a waggling finger, she is also up to no good herself. Her eyes are twinkling as the other hand pulls the cat's tail. Her brother is taunting the little cat. It is also young and immature too, with an eel, and the boy has a delighted and sheepish look on his face. But just look at that cat's paw. His nails are at the ready and his toes are spread apart. He's ready to go berserk. Well, morality paintings like this one usually feature children from the underprivileged classes. I mean, just look at the shoeless children in her husband's painting, for example. These children are dressed in expensive clothing. I mean, just look at her ruff. But she didn't always have a ruff. In an ex-radiograph, we can see that she originally had a kerchief instead, with the ends crossed over her chest. I really hope that the National Gallery can acquire more Leyster in the future. She really is the best. Next up, we have 3 paintings by Rachel Ruysch. During her lifetime, she was one of the most commercially successful still life painters in the Netherlands, and she also attracted wealthy clients who were willing to pay her very handsomely. Out of our painters today, she had the longest career, painting for more than 6 decades and living until the ripe old age of 86. Now, usually when I talk about female painters, they usually share one thing in common. Their husbands or fathers were painters. Well, yes, Rachel's dad was Frederick Ruysch, and here he is in a portrait painted by her husband, Urian Poole. Frederick Ruysch was a botanist and an anatomist who drew detailed drawings of his specimens, but Rachel would advise him on how to make his still life works more balanced and appealing. By the way, Frederick Ruysch is especially represented at the Museum Vrolijk. That's Amsterdam's anatomical museum, and not only does it really forbid photos, it's too gruesome even for my channel, and that's telling you something. By the way, one of Rachel's sisters, Anna, was also a painter. Here's one of her still lifes. When she was 15 in 1679, Rachel was apprenticed to Willem van Aelst, a well-known flower painter. Coincidentally, his Amsterdam studio overlooked flower painter Maria van Oosterwijk's studio. She could have provided a valuable example to Rachel that a woman could earn a good living as an artist. As a young woman, Rachel palled around with other female painters, such as Alida Withuis and Johanna Halina Withold. She married Urian Poole in 1693 and went on to have 10 children. Woo! And she continued to work and paint. That was not common, but it was likely that she and Poole needed the higher income that her paintings could command over his. Rachel was eventually appointed as the court painter by Johann William, the Elector of the Palatinate. That was a German principality, so she had the respect of the highest in society. The National Gallery holds 3 Ruysch paintings, and since the Sainsbury wing has recently reopened, they're all on display. Many still life painters in the 17th and 18th centuries painted food as symbols of opulence, yes, but also as vanitas, depicting the fleeting nature of life and quickly fading beauty. For instance, a half-peeled lemon was a symbol of a life half-lived. However, flowers like these were also a popular vanitas. After all, cut flowers are soon destined for death. I love this one here, still life of flowers in a glass vase on a marble ledge. The butterflies and bees can represent the cycle of decay and serve as a reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly possessions. By the time she had died at the age of 86, she had produced hundreds of paintings. More than 250 have been attributed to her. Let's just pause here for a few minutes. I want to tell you about some artists whose work is held here by the National Gallery, but that are not on display. I went through the entire catalog the other day and emailed the gallery to make sure I hadn't missed any. And I think that these aren't on display, maybe because they aren't the most dazzling examples or there just isn't the right place for them right now. But I want to give a shout out here to the only known work by Marie Blancourt, a French woman who is thought to have lived during the 17th century. Henriette Brown, which was the pseudonym for Jules Dessau, painting a child here, and Marie Cazin, who studied under Rosa Bonheur, who we'll meet shortly. She specialized in landscapes and animals. I actually really love this post-impressionist piece, and I wish they would display it in those galleries, which are so overwhelmingly male. I think it would fit right in. Now, according to the National Gallery, of the 2,600 plus paintings in the collection, there are 27 paintings by women. However, the artists that we've spoken about today only account for 19 of them. So what's the discrepancy? Well, I got in touch with the curation department by email, and the 8 unaccounted paintings are those purchased from contemporary artists in residence over the last 30 or so years. They don't appear in the online catalog, and they're not on display. Finally, there is also this replica of an altarpiece predella from Bologna, originally painted by Francesco del Cosa and Ercole de Robert, depicting the life of Saint Vincent Ferrer. This replica was painted in 1929 by Rosa Falcone and Carine Palmieri, and was presented to the National Gallery in 1930 by Pope Pius XI. Now let's move on to the 18th century. Here we have a work by Rosalba Carriera, an Italian Rococo painter who lived between 1673 and 1757. During her lifetime, she painted kings and royalty, and famous artists like Joshua Reynolds collected her works. She hailed from Venice, and unusually for our tour, her father wasn't a painter, he was a lawyer. However, her mother Alba was an embroiderer and lace maker, so very much involved in creative endeavors. Rosalba engaged in lace making, and when that industry began to falter at the beginning of the 18th century, she turned to painting as a way to bring in money, with the help of her sister Giovanna. She specialized in miniatures, but would later become known for her pastel portraits, like this one here called Portrait of a Man. This is pastel on paper, and it dates to the 1720s. There was no shortage of international clientele making their way through Venice. 18th century men from Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Germany spent a lot of time in the city on their grand tours. Some of her most famous early clients were Frederick IV of Denmark and Augustus the Strong, King of Poland. He was so impressed that he went on to become a collector of her work. Now, we don't know who this guy is, but he's wearing the finest fashions of the day, with a curly white wig held back with a black ribbon, and an embroidered brocade jacket paired with a cravat. Though Carrera had many foreign sitters, this is likely a Venetian local, since this portrait remained in Venice until the late 19th century. This is a good example of the Rococo style with which she was associated, with the pastel colors that are a hallmark of Rococo style. It has an ethereal quality to it that is missing from painted canvases. Carrera was known for using white chalk in her underdrawings so that the results would be more luminous, especially with the hair, lace, and skin. I mean, this reminds me of modern day highlighting in makeup. Carrera was the most influential and celebrated pastel artist in the 18th century, and also the most successful female artist in Europe at the time, full stop. In 1730, she traveled to the royal court in Vienna, and the Emperor Charles VI became her benefactor. He amassed a collection of more than 150 of her works, and she in turn gave painting lessons to his wife, the Empress. She came to this country, and while here, she had a number of important followers, namely William Hoare of Bath, Francis Coates, and John Russell. King George III later purchased these pieces in 1762. Sadly, Carriera fell into a deep depression after the death of her sister Giovanna. She also underwent surgery to remove her cataracts, but ended up losing her vision completely. She died at the age of 84 in Venice, outliving everyone in her family. She was left out of art history books until around the last 50 years. This happens again and again. Despite her fame and talent, Carriera gets treated like an exception, an oddity rather than an example of a successful artist. And then, as an outlier, she gets written out of history. Now let's stay in the 18th century. This is Self-Portrait in a Straw Hat, a signed copy of a very popular self-portrait by Elisabeth Vigée Le Brun. While it may look, at first glance, like a typical 18th century portrait, there are a few glaring details that tell us something different is happening here. First of all, this woman isn't powdered, and she isn't wearing a wig. Her natural beauty is allowed to shine at a time when women were heavily made up for most portraits. She's also the one holding the palette in a very bold and prominent way, just like we've already seen with Catharina van Hemmesen and Judith Leyster. She's showing us that she is the artist, and yes, she is a woman. Here is another self-portrait where she is even more deliberate in showing herself as the artist. Elisabeth Vigée Le Brun was born in Paris in 1755 to a portrait painter. Her father was successful, here is one of his works, but he died when she was just 12. She began selling portraits at the age of 14, contributing to the family income, and her passion for not only the art of painting, but business was stoked. She married an art dealer, Jean-Baptiste Pierre Le Brun, who eventually helped her earn commissions and make contacts. Though she took his name, they did eventually divorce, but they seem to have remained on good terms. She was extremely successful in the years just before the French Revolution of 1789, especially in the Versailles court. She was also one of only 4 women who was admitted to the Académie Royale during the 18th century. Here is her admission piece. I love this. Now, this painting from a few years later absolutely scandalized the Academy when it was shown. Why? Her parted lips, revealing her teeth. Women's lips were meant to remain decidedly closed, but here she is, showing off a wholesome smile. However, it was her role as Marie Antoinette's favorite portrait painter that helped cement her career and high society reputation, and would almost cost her her head. Vigée Le Brun displayed a portrait of Marie Antoinette wearing a simple white chemise and holding a rose. This was incredibly scandalous due to its informality and the fact it looked like a nightie. It was removed within days, and she replaced it with this one, a more respectable blue dress. She became Marie Antoinette's preferred painter and painted 30 portraits of her and her children within 6 years. However, when the royal family was arrested in October 1789, Vigée Le Brun fled Paris to travel the continent with her young daughter, and she did not return until 1802. This portrait was exhibited in 1782 at the Salon de la Correspondance in Paris and at the 1783 Salon of the Académie Royale. She deliberately modeled her self-portrait on Peter Paul Rubens' Portrait of Susanna London, which was often known as Le Chapeau de Paille, the straw hat. The hat in this picture is actually made of beaver felt, and Vigée Le Brun wanted to challenge this error playfully. I love this new curation at the National Gallery that places them side by side. This is really so special. Vigée Le Brun was inspired by the way that the Rubens hat's broad rim cast the woman's face in shadow, and it was instead lit solely by reflected light. She wrote, "This painting delights me and inspired me to make my own portrait in Brussels in search of the same effect. I painted myself wearing a straw hat with a feather and a garland of wildflowers and holding my palette. When the portrait was exhibited at the Salon, I dare say it greatly enhanced my reputation." Though her hair and lack of makeup may seem informal, Vigée Le Brun is very calculating with this image. She is deliberately positioning herself as a great artist and an expert. She's holding her tools, posing outdoor in natural light, and staring at us openly and directly. She's not shy or coy. She wears a low-cut dress that evokes what a shepherdess would wear. This was a popular reference. Even Marie Antoinette liked to dress up as a peasant and had a fake rustic village, Hameau de la Reine, or the Queen's Hamlet, built on the grounds of Versailles. Now, we actually have two Vigée Le Brun pieces here at the National Gallery. This one is a portrait of Mademoiselle Brongniart. How sweet is she? Her father was Alexandre Théodore Brongniart, the developer of Père Lachaise Cemetery, and I talk about him in that video. The little girl, Alexandrine Emilie, was the youngest of his three daughters and was only 7 months younger than Vigée Le Brun's daughter, Julie. The family shared a close bond, even hiding the mother and daughter in their home during the Reign of Terror. This bond survived the revolution. Monsieur Brongniart was one of the 255 signatories to seeking Vigée Le Brun's removal from the list of potential traitors in 1799, and he and his wife successfully called for her return to Paris in 1802. This portrait is very inspired by Jean-Baptiste Greuze and his painting of children. You can see the sweet similarities. Sadly, Julie passed away from syphilis in 1819, devastating Elizabeth. She went on to live until the age of 86, still socializing and painting, and died in 1846. Her grave is in Louveciennes, where she spent her later years. If there is one grave I am devastated to have missed in Père Lachaise Cemetery, it is the grave of Rosa Bonheur. My video on that topic is already packed full of queer history, and so adding Rosa's story would have been perfect, but alas, her name doesn't feature on any of the quote must-visit graves or the 101 famous graves list. In fact, Parmentier, known for his potato cultivation, is more commonly featured on lists than Rosa Bonheur, who was the most famous painter of her age. Which is a huge shame because she went on to inspire the Impressionists. She was outspoken, queer, and talented as hell. I will come back to her biography soon, but first, let's talk about this painting. Rosa Bonheur was best known as a painter of animals, an animalière, and this is Le Marché aux Chevaux, or the horse fair or horse market. But it is not only a frenetic riot of color, light, and literal horsepower. It includes a hidden self-portrait. More on that soon. Now, this painting isn't the full-size version. There is a more iconic and larger version in the Met in New York. It's 4 times the size. I didn't see it when I was there, but one day when I visit New York City in the future, I will stand in front of it in awe. The full-size version was first exhibited at the Salon of 1855, and it caused a major sensation, turning her into a celebrity. But I mean, this version isn't tiny. It's a pretty big canvas in its own right, and I love its new location in the stairwell here. But this version was created to allow for printmaking. That's how famous it was. Everyone wanted their own copy, even though they couldn't believe that it was created by a woman. A quote at the time was, "Rosa Bonheur paints almost like a man." And so she does, but she's so much better than most. Let's have a look at the details. The scene shows handlers parading their horses through the market in Paris. To gain access to this horse fair, which she visited at least twice a week for 18 months, she needed police permission to wear trousers, and this permission had to be countersigned by her doctor and renewed every 6 months. She also chose to wear men's clothing so that she could escape harassment. Remember that art was still considered very much a man's field. Though she would dress up in men's clothing for the rest of her life, Bonheur often claimed it was so that she could get up close with the animals, unencumbered by skirts. She made many sketches and studies, which you can see here. And here she is in this 1850s painting by Frederick Goodall, painting cattle in the Scottish Highlands. As we already know, as a female painter, she didn't have access to life drawing classes, so animals were more accessible subjects. This excluded her from most genres, and don't forget, she was still excluded from the Academy, as were most women, until late in her life. Rosa's full name was Marie Rosalie, which was shortened to Rosa, and she was born into a family of geniuses. Though they were of Jewish origin, they adhered to Saint Simeonism, a Christian socialist sect that promoted the education of women, which is likely why her father, Oscar Raymond Bonheur, also a painter, was willing to educate his daughters in the arts. Her siblings included the animal painter Auguste Bonheur and Juliette Bonheur, as well as the animal sculptor Isidore Jules Bonheur. They were a spectacular bunch. For more than 40 years, Rosa Bonheur lived with her partner Nathalie Micasse until Micasse's death. Now, this portrait here is from 1898, and it's by American painter and writer Anna Elizabeth Klumpke. This, too, is at the Met. Klumpke is best known for her portraits of famous women, including this one, but also of social reformer Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Rosa and Klumpke would go on to have a long relationship, which was likely romantic. As a child, Klumpke had owned a Rosa doll. That's how famous Rosa Bonheur was. They made mass-produced dolls of her. But Anna and Rosa met in 1895 when Bonheur was 73 and Klumpke was 39. Klumpke was intent on painting Bonheur and getting to know her. Within 3 years, the women were living together and had a contract in place. In exchange for a new art studio financed by Bonheur, Klumpke would paint 3 portraits of Bonheur and write her biography. They lived together until Bonheur's death in 1899, when Klumpke was named the sole heir to Bonheur's estate. She then opened the Rosa Bonheur Memorial Art School, providing art education for women, and the Museum of the Studio of Rosa Bonheur at Chateau de By, near the Palace of Fontainebleau. I can't wait to go the next time I'm in Paris. I mean, Paris is always a good idea, after all. Some of Anna's ashes also rest with Rosa at Père Lachaise. Now let's look back one more time at this painting and zoom in on the center. There is more than meets the eye here. This, for some time, has been widely accepted to be a self-portrait of Rosa Bonheur. We can see the hair flipping out of the cap, but this figure is also in 3/4 view, like a typical self-portrait as you look at yourself in the mirror. Now we're later in the 19th century. I spend a lot of time guiding the Impressionists here in the National Gallery, and it's one of my most requested topics. However, many of my guests don't realize there was a woman amongst the founding members of the Impressionists. Just a quick crash course on the Impressionists. To learn more, head over to my Musée d'Orsay videos. But they were a group of painters who were tired of being rejected by the Salon and its prescriptive categories of, quote, good art. In 1863, they started their own Salon des Refus, essentially the reject salon, and focused on painting outdoors, that is, en plein air, and capturing the way that light hit objects. 10 years later, Claude Monet, Auguste Renoir, Camille Pissarro, Alexander Sisley, Paul Cézanne, Berthe Morisot, and Edgar Degas formed a painting society and began exhibiting together to mixed reviews. The name of the art movement comes from this painting, Impression Sunrise by Monet. But to talk about Morisot, we need to remember just how tough it was for female painters to just head outside and paint en plein air. I mean, we already saw how difficult it was for Rosa Bonheur to get permission to paint at the horse fair. She had to get a police writ. Forget about the dance halls and beer gardens that Monet and Renoir were painting. For a woman like Morisot, who palled around with those guys, painting in public was seen as scandalous and a potential invitation to violence. That's why so many works by female impressionists are domestic scenes. They may be quieter, but they're no less arresting. Morisot was born into a genteel family in 1841. Her father was a senior administrator, and her mother, Marie-Josephine Cornélie Thomas, was the great-niece of Jean-Honoré Fragonard, the prolific Rococo painter, and cousin to veterinarian Honoré Fragonard, the mad scientist, and the subject of this gruesome video. tenuous connection. Over time, I always say all my videos end up connecting to each other. They were quite a genteel family, as I mentioned, and it was customary for girls of this social class to learn painting and drawing. So Berthe and her sister Edma studied under Joseph Guichard, but as women they couldn't be admitted to the École des Beaux-Arts. Even in her 20s, she needed to be chaperoned to visit the Louvre, but it is here where she met Edouard Manet, and was introduced to Camille Corot, who she also studied under. At the age of 30, she married Eugène Manet. He too was an artist, but he never achieved the success of his brother Edouard nor his wife, but he is described as enthusiastically supporting her work. I love that for her. They had one daughter named Julie, and Edouard and Berthe are said to have had a warm friendship throughout their life, with some wondering if perhaps they had stronger feelings for each other. These pieces here at the National Gallery date to the 1880s. We have two by Morisot. This one here, Summer's Day, was exhibited at the 5th Impressionist exhibition in 1880. It depicts two middle-class women in the Bois de Boulogne, a woodland park in Paris. We can see Morisot's characteristic zigzag brush strokes, which are especially dynamic down here on the surface of the water. This other piece is called Girl on a Divan. This is technically on loan from the Tate. The major art museums often work together like this. Morisot's daughter dated this one to 1885, and it likely portrays a paid model, but there is a familiarity in the model's gaze that suggests they may have been friends. Morisot was often criticized for leaving her pieces, quote, unfinished. They were described in French as vaporeuses, misty or steamy, and at the 1880 Impressionist exhibition, one reviewer said, "Why, with her talent, does she not take the trouble to finish?" But this is clearly a conscious decision on Morisot's part. The works are light and delicate. She sadly died of pneumonia at the age of 54. Towards the end of her life, she said, "I don't think there has ever been a man who treated a woman as an equal, and that's all I would have asked for I know I am worth as much as they." That could be the theme of this whole video. Now we come to the gallery's most recent acquisition by a woman, Eva Gonzalez's The Full-Length Mirror, which features her beloved sister Jeanne, who often served as her model. Her sister's face is somewhat mysterious. Gonzalez has left some of her features indistinct. For the female Impressionists, models could be too scandalous for proper lady painters to use. Models were often sex workers, after all, and so women like Cassatt and Morisot often used family members, and Eva painted her sister Jeanne throughout her life. Jeanne was also a painter herself, and in this painting she is standing in front of a full-length mirror called a Psyche. The mirror was named for the goddess Psyche, who writer La Fontaine described as looking in a full-length mirror. There's a long tradition of women being painted in mirrors. Think of the Rokeby Venus, and Morisot also painted women in mirrors with their features left out, so there's clearly a conversation going on here with some of the female Impressionists. Eva Gonzalez was born in Paris in 1849. Her father was a publisher and her mother was a musician. Her parents loved to host soirées, and her drawings were shown at these evening parties, attracting the attention of the bohemian set. Remember, the École des Beaux-Arts banned women, so despite her evident talent, young Eva couldn't go to study art in a formal school setting. Instead, girls could join an atelier or studio. She began an apprenticeship in the studio of Charles Chaplin. Not that Charles Chaplin. He, a painter, hosted a program for female artists so that they could practice life painting. Here, she got the attention of the well-known and controversial painter Edouard Manet in 1869, and he took her on as his student. Gonzalez was his only formal pupil throughout his entire career. He began this portrait of her the same year. But it's actually quite silly because she's so delicate in this pristine white dress, painting some very feminine flowers. I want to point out that Eva Gonzalès had never painted a single floral piece, at least at this point, and the piece she's working on is also framed and finished. Like Morisot, she couldn't head to the bars and moulins to paint nightlife or raucous going-ons. She was restricted to suitable subject matter, which Manet clearly thinks is flowers, or at least he wants to show his audience that he thinks that. However, maybe he is paying homage to Vigée Le Brun. After all, she too was dressed in her finest clothing. Manet definitely had some second thoughts about this. He had to start this portrait again about 40 times. We know this from his letters to Berthe Morisot. He put paint on paint and scraped it off, and we can really see this on Eva's face. It didn't do great at the salon. Poor Manet, he was forever getting trashed at the salon. Gonzalez's face was compared to plaster, and I think she looks like Maria Milagro de Hoyos after Carl Tanzler was done with her. She kind of looks stiff and creepy. However, Eva Gonzalès herself was thriving. She soon produced her most well-known piece, a box at the Italian Theatre in 1874. Though their formal relationship ended by the mid-1870s, Gonzalès and Manet remained friends and even peers until they both died within a few weeks of each other in 1883. He died of syphilis, and though she was in her sickbed with an infection after childbirth, she is said to have sat up and woven a wreath for the grave of her former master. She died shortly afterwards, just 34 years old. This painting is small but packs a powerful punch. It's understated, mottled and monochrome, but despite its muted colors, it's very arresting, and we can see that Jeanne is holding a small red flower in her hands. The National Gallery acquired the Manet portrait of Gonzalès in 1917, but finally, just last year in 2024, they acquired a painting by her. Here is our 10th female painter with canvases hanging in the National Gallery, but hers are indeed a little bit different than the 9 women we have already seen. I mentioned Dame Paula Rego already. She was artist in residence here in 1990 and 1991, and the National Gallery purchased this unbelievable work from her during that time. Now, there is a lot to say about this work. There was an entire exhibition and book dedicated to it. But I'll just give a bit of an overview today. Rego was born in Lisbon in 1935 and studied at the Slade School of Fine Art. Here, she became an exhibiting member of the London Group, along with David Hockney and Frank Auerbach. The London Group was founded in 1913 as a democratic alternative to the Royal Academy. Rego has been hailed as the most important woman painter of the 20th century, and that's why I'm so delighted to have made this video. See, I didn't even know that this piece was here. It was originally hung in what was called the Sainsbury Wing restaurant, but since this wing's reopening in May, the restaurant's now called Locatelli. By the way, if you ever want to buy me lunch here, I will gladly accept. During her residence here, Rego took inspiration from an altarpiece by the 15th century Italian artist Carlo Crivelli, La Madonna della Rondine, or the Madonna of the Swallow. Crivelli painted this around 1490, but in her version, Rego tells the stories of women from biblical history and folklore. We can see Delilah, Mary Magdalene, St. Catherine, and the Virgin Mary, all scattered throughout a reimagining of Crivelli's garden, but now decorated with Portuguese blue and white tiles in a nod to Rego's own heritage. The tiles themselves are illuminated with scenes from Aesop's fables and tales from Ovid. Rego based her depictions of these women on people that she actually knew, including staff members here at the National Gallery. The gallery has even released a key to help us identify who is who. Now let's look closer at Delilah for a moment. Rather than show her passively trapped under Samson, as she is here in Rubens' painting, Rego has her crawling atop the helpless man, as if she is calculating or even stalking prey. Rego also interprets Catherine of Alexandria. Here she is wielding a sword. In this version, she has just decapitated Roman Emperor Maxentius for his role in her torture. His severed head was modeled on novelist Rudi Nassauer, Rego's friend and lover. I didn't go to this exhibition in 2021 at the Tate Britain, and I am still kicking myself, but I do love guiding this painting now. As well as this final wall mural by Bridget Riley, here in Annenberg Court. It's a very unusual piece. It isn't on a canvas, and it isn't very historic. It's pretty recent. These orange, green, and purple circles are called Messengers by Bridget Riley, one of the most important British contemporary artists. The title, Messengers, is inspired by John Constable. His Hey Wayne is in my second National Gallery video, and he painted hundreds of cloud studies. He called clouds messengers. The work also evokes the early pointillism of Georges Seurat. His work is also one of the most important in the National Gallery, and Riley spent a period of her early career emulating and copying his works after seeing The Bridge at Courbevoie at the Courtauld Gallery. This copy still hangs in her studio and formed the basis of the 2015 exhibit Bridget Riley, Learning from Seurat. Riley was born in 1930 in Norwood, London. She attended Goldsmiths and the Royal College of Art and then rose to prominence in the 1960s with her signature op art style, that is, optical art. Art that creates optical illusions and plays with viewers' senses of depth and ways of seeing. This style of art is characterized by high contrast, geometric shapes, and a lot of black and white, and later, colors. Much of her work is on display at the Tate Britain, and I will cover that gallery in the future. Now, this abstract work was only unveiled in 2019 when she was 87. Riley is now 94 and still creating art, splitting her time between Cornwall and France. Of this piece, Riley says, "I want to make you or the viewer feel alive, to have a kind of joy in feeling alive. I just hope that they gave you pleasure." And that is a fitting way to end our tour. Well, standing here in front of Artemesia Gentileschi, that's the end of our tour. I hope that you've enjoyed walking through this part of art history with me, and I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.